Good evening, Forest Mill. It's your friendly neighborhood preacher here. Uh, I hope that you're doing well. Missed you guys last week. We were on vacation, um, but we made it back safely. Had a good week and all of that. It is certainly good to be back and good to be with you. We had a great Sunday morning last Sunday, and we want to just pick up a little bit and go through our Wednesday night Bible study. We've been going through um, the book of Psalms, and if you haven't been joining us, we've had a really good study. We've had a good time of going through the Psalms, and I was a little discouraged this last week, and I mentioned to you that we lost, or I lost my computer, including the lessons I had set up for Wednesday night. So I'm having to start over from scratch this week. But it's a great psalm. It's a really a psalm of comfort. I know a lot of times that when I'm just struggling or discouraged, I look for passages of scripture for reassurance, and this is certainly one of my very favorites. It's a psalm that speaks calm into the midst of a storm. So we just want to start. I'm going to make 3 quick points from this psalm. It's Psalm 62. If you have your Bibles and want to join in or read along, Psalm 62, beginning at verse 1, where David says, "Truly, my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress, and I will never be shaken. How long will you assault me? Would all of you throw me down, this leaning wall, this tottering fence? Surely they intend to topple me from my lofty place. They take delight in lies. With their mouths they bless, but their hearts they curse. Yes, my soul finds rest in God. My hope comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on him, on God. He is my mighty rock and my refuge. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. Surely the lowborn are but a breath, the highborn are but a lie. If weighed on a balance, they are nothing. Together they are only a breath. Do not trust in extortion or put vain hope in stolen goods. Though your riches increase, do not set your heart on them. One thing God has spoken, 2 things I have heard. Power belongs to you, God, and with you, Lord, is unfailing love, and you reward everyone according to what they've done." Really a powerful passage. And I just want to make 3 quick points that kind of sum up the heart of David's argument here. Number 1, the point in which we can take hope and take solace is that God is always consistent. Our soul, as a result, can only truly find rest in who God is. Psalm 3:5 says, "I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me." It doesn't matter what the issues around us are, and there are certainly plenty of issues for us to worry about. But regardless of what we're facing, whether it's social issues or disease or money problems or relationship problems in our family, whatever the issues are around us, they all call for us to seek out God. The one thing in our lives that is always consistent is God. Sometimes I feel like I'm a really good guy, like I'm on the ball. I'm being a good husband or a good father or a good preacher or a good friend, or I'm on the ball with those things. But I'll tell you, there's some days that I'm pretty bad at all of those things, or one of those things at a time. Hopefully I can narrow it down. But yeah, God is not like that. God doesn't have off days. God is always consistent. Note the wording of verse 2, looking back up at Psalm 62, verse 2. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. So, sometimes we tend to think of God as a God of the past tense, right? God was the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. God was the Father who sent the Son and sent the Spirit. God was all these things. But David is noting that God is in the present, that God alone is. That means that in no other is there found comfort and rest. In none other is there security than in understanding his will. In none other is there salvation and completeness discovered. We have to admit this at the beginning of each day and at the end of each day. This is something that calls for us to repeat it and remind ourselves. It's in speaking it, whether we're alone in prayer or we're singing it in the car or we're having conversations with other believers, just reminding ourselves day in and day out that God alone is. That's the message of the cross, that God is in good times and in bad times, and in the best of circumstances and the worst of circumstances, God still is. And so we have to have this desire to draw closer to him. David asked something that I'm sure we've all asked before. How long, oh God? How long must I endure what's happening here? And even David's confession, he believes it's God who's bringing about the trial. He places. How long will you assault me? Right? He's putting the blame on God, and that sounds like a terrible thing to blame God for our troubles or our struggles. But in another way, it can be kind of comforting if you know the one through whom they're going through with this trial. God's not going to do something bad to you, that what he is doing is for your own good, for my own good, and he's not going to do something beyond our ability to endure with him at our side. So we can take comfort that even in the worst of times, God is still there. So that's number one, point one, that God is consistent. Number two, I want to point out that rest, true rest, comes from the Lord. Verse 5 says, yes, my soul finds rest in God. My hope comes from him. And then we see down in verse 7, my salvation and honor depend on God. He's my mighty rock and my refuge, right? This mighty rock, this refuge, it's a buffering place where the winds and the storms can't get at you, where you can be hidden from the blazing heat of the day if you're in the desert, or the terrors of the night when you're out alone. God is that sort of shelter, that refuge, that strong tower of protection. Proverbs 3, verses 5 through 6, one of my very favorite passages, says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. This idea that God is so strong and so mighty and so capable and so present that we can trust in him no matter the circumstances. The Apostle Paul said in Hebrews 2, verse 13, he says, and again, I will put my trust in him. Again, I will put my trust in him. Trust is something that God holds sacred, and it's something that we develop over the course of time through relationship with him. So no matter what the struggle is, there's always hope in God. And finally, point 3. I got to get my hands up here. David calls for us to set our hearts on God's treasures. Set our hearts on God's treasures. Have you ever thought about how much of our pain and angst and worry and anxiety, or how much of that is pinned on treasures of this world, right? worrying about the financial things or all the temporal things of this life. When God calls for us to look to Him and treasure Him in our hearts. And David writes using these scales of justice. The idea you get good people over here and bad people over there, and it all evens out. Like if God were weighing all the good people and all the bad people, it would still be equal. In other words, they're all the same to God. In Romans chapter 2, verse 11, we hear this famous passage, God is no respecter of persons. People, all people, good people, bad people, wealthy people, poor people, young people, old people. We were all part of God's creation and all designed to worship Him. So in this knowledge, we have to be willing to admit who we are as well. Where do I fall in here? I sometimes tend to think more highly of myself. I'll see someone who's really struggling. Maybe they're going through problems with relationships or with addiction or with holding down a job or all these things that are struggles in this life. And I'll say, "Whoa, thank goodness, I'm not having to go through that right now." But there's no difference between us. There is none who God thinks of as more, and none who God thinks of as less. I am equally loved in His eyes as the person who's sitting in a prison cell on death row. There's no difference in God's eyes. And so David says, don't let money control you. That's the factor in this life more than any other, is this money and the power that comes with us. That's what we use to determine someone's worth, someone's value. But that's not the way God works. So David says, set your heart on God's treasures, so you'll see things and see people the way He does. When we set our hearts on the temporal things, on money or possessions or pride or fame or fortune, all of that leads to an idol worship. It draws our hearts away from God. It's not a matter of what we have in our pocket or what we have in our bank accounts. It's a matter of what we have in our hearts. So God, David says, God speaks to me quite clearly through all of these events and tells me that, number one, He tells me He's strong, and number two, He tells me He's very loving, right? And look at the word choice. David says that God spoke these things to him. That God spoke this strength and spoke this love to him. So we have to tune in to God to develop that sense of hearing. And if David weren't listening, then all of God's utterances would have gone completely unnoticed. So David was tuned in to the voice of God. It doesn't come through osmosis. It doesn't come from parking on a church pew on Sunday mornings. It doesn't come from having Bibles spread around your house or having grown up in a Christian household. Hearing the voice of God comes through daily diligence in our relationship with God. Because of who God is, because of His strength, because of His love, our hearts should always be tuned to Him. And then David wraps up this particular psalm with a word of warning that each of us is rewarded according to the things we have done. Again, Paul echoes this same sentiment in the New Testament, where he says, "And every man will receive his own reward according to his labor." We are being weighed by a God who loves all, being judged by a judge who wants to acquit all, not willing that any should perish, that all should come to a knowledge of the truth. But we are responsible for our deeds. We cannot write them off. We cannot blame the other people in our lives. We cannot blame the circumstances in which we find ourselves. We will be weighed according to our own deeds and our circumstances, and God is just. Well, I hope that's just a word of comfort for you in the middle of this week. Really looking forward to this coming Sunday morning. And by the way, if you haven't had an opportunity yet to pick up one of the donation bottles for the Pregnancy Crisis Center in our tables, I'm going to try to mention that again Sunday morning, but we really want to encourage everybody to participate in that fundraiser, that we could offer hope to those in our community who are struggling with family issues, for young women and even sometimes young men who are trying to be dads and not knowing what they're doing. I mean, it's a hard situation. It's a life-altering situation. And if we can speak just a word of hope in that situation, I think that's a good testimony for our church and for the God that we serve. May God bless you and the study of his word this week.